Just have a few responses from Lili, Hermann, and Camilo, and let's just open this up to a chat about some of the themes that were raised by Pelle. So, Camilo, do you want to take it away?
Thank you so much for sharing attempts to bring economic democracy to your country. It's really inspiring to hear some of the practical stories of workers sharing their creativity and participating in the process of design. I grew up a working class kid, son of immigrants in this country, and for me this is very personal because I grew up with my father who worked as a construction worker for over 30 years, discussing over dinner how he would give advice to the civil engineers about what they were doing wrong and how he'd be often ignored. And, you know, the story would go on until the self-fulfilling prophecy came true and some of his suggestions were finally relented to. But it's not unusual for us working class people, immigrants, women, people of color, to be seen as ignorant, to be seen as not smart enough to make these decisions around our lives and our surroundings. So I'll just share one more thing about my mom. My mom, for example, worked 40 years as a garment worker, doing piecework. And in some of your writings, you talked about how you were able to engage with workers and deal with some of the skepticisms of new technology, and through participation, you were able to transform that into an opportunity for creativity and for something new. My mother, after 41 years of sewing labels on women's dresses in a union shop, was introduced to something called Just Time. It's part of lean production, and theoretically, it makes a lot of practical sense for workers. The idea that if you can reduce the amount of time between the product and the consumer, you can save in warehouse space, you can really work toward conservation. But in the economic context of the United States, the interests of my mother wasn't at hand. The interest wasn't of the workers to introduce lean production, so what it did was decimate and deunionize this workforce. So for me, many of the insights that you've brought up bring up some of the challenges as organizers, as labor organizers, community organizers. For example, when you talked about how your relationship to the workers was well received because you were nice, I work with a lot of activists who think being right is enough. They think facts are enough, are sufficient, and we have to often look at the long-term goals. How do we actually create relationships and dialogue, and how do we subvert this idea of banker knowledge, the popular education approach, where there's experts and the unknowing masses. And so I really appreciate that point that you highlighted, how it's relational. If we want to transform the economy, we need to figure out how we can learn together. And I had a question related to the tension between working in an academic context and what people are paying good money to learn, right? Certain skills which are valuable and specialized, and the idea of trying to implement a participatory model that in some ways levels the playing field and creates a participatory mechanism. And you discussed a little bit about that tension of trying to focus on product versus process, profit versus a community-based model. But if you have any advice of how have you sustained your career, built new projects, despite sometimes the economic tension between your interests and the interests of those that might fund projects that would not really be your priority.
Could you take the last part once more?
Sure. So the tension between the economic interests of creating these project-based, profit-driven processes, and how have you grappled with building consensus support within an academic environment for a new way, a way that is participatory, a way that is community-based? You've been doing this for a while, and I feel like we can all learn from ways that you've developed that consensus and built allies in the community and unions and in the university.
Okay. It's done? Yeah. Well, I think my personal story in this is not so interesting because, I mean, I'm a white middle-class professor that has all these opportunities, and I've been economically secure even if the project doesn't come through and so on. So that's kind of, but the way I would like to answer the question is that I think that for design schools in general, there is a potential. Now, I should start here and say I think professional designers have a very important role to play in these projects together with lay designers. But there is, I think, a responsibility for the schools to change their curriculum to prepare the professional design students to be able to deal with these kind of issues. So if we look at like design schools like Central St. Martin in London, to some extent Parsons, and many of the Scandinavian design schools, there is a change in the curriculum, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater what we had before, but to start to train or to support a repertoire of co-design practices. And I think, I don't know if you think that is a sufficient answer, but I think that actually the design schools make a difference. I think that if I look at, now I took Central St. Martin in London as an example, I think they have some fascinating projects and they're teaching their students some really interesting things that maybe in the short run they think they would not be professional enough in this or that specific part of design. But I think they are a kind of designers that will be able to do some of the work that we're talking about here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to come back to that because that's hitting that's hitting home. There were a number of points you made that were very interesting to me, and it also reminded me of a personal story that some of the people in the room have heard. But I wanted to say that a lot of the work that I do, excuse me.
There is some water there.
No, it's okay. It's just me. But the work I do with students and alums and other faculty is in South Asia. And in South Asia and in Japan, where I've also gone to study this, Sweden is really the model. Scandinavia is the model on how to build cooperative communities, how to build cooperative decision-making, how to creatively reach across stakeholders to do really meaningful and multidimensional responses to issues or design problems if they're framed that way. So it's really fascinating for me to hear you speak because everywhere I go, the model is always referred back to Sweden. And I was curious about a number of things you said about when people try to organize, what the resistance to to those participatory processes or cooperative organizations might be. I know that where I've been working most recently, cooperatives are just about non-existent. They were driven out by the government, who took over control of the initiatives. And this is right next door to India, where cooperatives are booming, and where cooperatives are multi-sector and are quite effective. And in Japan, they're even more multidimensional and multi-sector. So I'm personally very intrigued about that. But then in reading some of your writings and listening to you tonight, and having you go through the timeline that was quite personal, I recognize those early computers. But I was wondering whether you think that there's been this progression of different forms of inquiry and different attitudes toward participation. But I'm wondering whether there's something in the earlier periods that you feel we still have to learn from in terms of what were the questions being asked. I certainly feel that. So the personal story I just want to mention briefly is that I grew up in a community in the woods where there was a university major that was a major university in name. I don't think anybody would have held it up as, the avant-garde in inquiry at that time. But because it was in the woods and because it had some sort of a name, there was a period, it exactly coincided with the period you started to talk about, or a little earlier. It was really 1960 to 61, when a group of mathematicians were brought in from Princeton, and they developed the basic computer language. And so it was Dartmouth College. And so they were coming up with the computer language that allowed the personal computer to come into existence. At the same time that they came there, and this is, we've had a lot of discussions lately about how innovation actually happens, and this whole focus now on innovation labs and how people are trying to micromanage the process of innovation and design in a way that a lot of us feel isn't possible. So what I'm trying to explain is what the ecosystem was that emerged at that time. So we had Kemeny and Kurtz at Dartmouth doing the computer work. Then there was an engineer brought in from UCLA who believed that design was a critical part of engineering, and that to get out of the theoretical and into actually making a difference in the world, you had to be learning through doing. And he also believed very much in entrepreneurship. So he pulled together a group of engineers who were out-of-the-box thinkers and just said, go to it. He let them loose. Nobody was looking. It was in the backwoods of New Hampshire. And then the third component was, and this was a few years later, was that the Meadowses, who were the systems dynamics people, came from Harvard and MIT. And they began their explorations into organizational management and into again, systems and how they behave and how they evolve. And what the last component, so we had these three groups all becoming very active, and nobody was watching, and they were doing their thing. And what happened was they burst out of the academy. And they burst into the local community, which was still in 1960 a community that was coming out of what it had been in the 30s under Roosevelt. It was one of the target areas for a lot of the New Deal programs. It was considered still an impoverished area, that part of New Hampshire, Vermont. And the people who broke out of the academy felt that there was indigenous knowledge that was as valuable as academic knowledge. And they pulled those people in and created a partnership with them. And I would say that it evolved into a full partnership. And so you had these spinning circles within particular arenas of inquiry that were crashing into each other, infecting each other, and then the fact that it was an inclusive society that was being built. And this is now being studied, it's been studied for years now in business schools and in schools, in programs on planning and development as one of the case studies of where it really worked. And it worked, it was an accident in a funny way. It was an accident, but the environment was right for letting these people have free rein. And so I'm curious about these two things. How do we promote, how do we address these issues of social equity and of creativity that has meaning outside of the elite classes, that actually is being applied in a very ground up, bottom-up way, that's being developed in a bottom-up way with the very people who are most impacted by our often bad decisions. Anyway.
Oh, wow. Well, you want to go? Okay. Well, first about the Scandinavian model, at least the part that has to do with design and participation. I'm thinking it's really important to not only to tell the bright side of the story, but also that there are all the time backlashes in this. So one thing, and the reason I think it's important to tell it, it's not just to be naive about what you try to do, but also one of the worries I have, for instance, for schools, and this is that is the idea that there is a simple method that can be taught, and this links back to what you were saying later. So okay, you organize like this and this, you set up like this and this, you have some design thinking to go with it, and there are 3 textbooks you can read on it. But I think the point is it's always extremely situated, and it's the competence of being able to read what we talked about earlier today, the glimmers of hope that people show in a situation, and act on that rather than on a prescribed procedure for how participation should evolve. That's one thing. And the other thing that worries me a lot in Scandinavia is that people are so tired of going to one participatory meeting after another leading to nothing. So under the umbrella of participation, when business basically is as usual, and people have really been politically engaged and believing in the vitalization of democracy, I just want to go and do my work instead of me sitting into these meetings. So that's part of it as well. And finally, I think it's a fascinating story you're telling about a truly innovative and creative environment. And I think you're right. Again, there, I think one should be very, again, not writing recipes for how to do it, as you're saying. I mean, that was a special coincidence that happened there. They had the understanding of the indigenous community. They had some spectacular scientific skills that came together, etc. And I mean, in my world, when I came from computer science to begin with, Xerox PARC was a similar thing in Palo Alto, but everyone that's tried to copy Xerox PARC, it's not been the same. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. So it's more, I think, about being attuned to the specifics. And I have a colleague that some of you know, Lucy Suchman. She was former with Xerox and Berkeley and professor in Lancaster for many years. She has a very good point, I think, about instead of focusing so much on those places that name themselves the innovative hubs, starting to look more for other, less known, less spectacular places, and see, and much more mundane, maybe not rocket science, and that there are many such little places that could be just as interesting, maybe not Nobel Prize winners, but how do we, instead of repeating Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley, how can we start to name other, much more mundane, much in the many places? Yeah.
So, on the theme of participation, let's open this up now to discussion, debate, comments, observations. Shall we take a cluster of of observations, comments, and then go on? So, just put your hand up and yeah.
Just a quick question. Just building upon what you just said, something we were discussing at lunch, and you just mentioned again, are these ideas of backlashes, and that there's ideas seem to have this kind of shelf life, and then there's a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's this kind of dialectic that happens. And I'm interested, like maybe as just to pose a potential way of thinking about the question that Lili brings up about kind of how these things are situated in particular places. I guess the question is something like, how do we read these dialectics? Even in your presentation, you know, you have these different phases that you kind of went through in your own career. And I guess I'm just trying to kind of understand better kind of how we can create kind of a maximum availability for possibilities and these kind of discourses, and bringing more people into these conversations, and also empowering everybody within that to give them the tools to be able to actualize these things, which I think we touched on a little bit in the context of makerspaces and so forth, but yet there's still something that is wanting from that model. And I guess I'm just trying to suggest maybe there's not that a solution, there's not that kind of model for innovation, which I think you guys you're pointing out, and there's not a method, there's not a dogma, but there's conversation, there's a dialectic, right, that I believe is progressive, that is moving forward, that accumulates knowledge and allows us to kind of build upon that. I don't know if there's really a question there. I'm just kind of responding, I think.
Can I respond to that? Because when you were talking, and you used the term commons, which I really appreciated. I was writing notes madly that that the way these makerspaces operate is that they really are part of the public realm, and so the idea of a redefined public realm as one of productivity and creativity I found really intriguing. So I was interested in that. You want to talk any more about that?
Before that, could we have something more in? You wanted to come as well? See? Or there was. Sorry. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering, because active participation calls for some level of literacy on context. So as you mentioned previously, people voted for you because they liked the way you looked. And it made me wonder, is that the best solution, and how did you tackle that problem?
And one over here, and then just one over there.
I was struck because, like Lili, having lived through much of this development history, and I thought, I wonder how much the students realize how things used to be produced in what we think of as a creative realm of publishing or graphic design or things like this, how much mundane work was involved in putting together a publication and doing physical paste up. Or the first thing that I worked on, we had to submit even though we typed the whole document in a word processor, we had to give it to a publisher, and it had to be retyped because there were people whose jobs depended on retyping the whole thing, and then we had to proof it and send it back and do, back and forth. And so how much this has changed as an industry, and I'm struck in your presentation of how much you're sort of chasing the technology or trying to invent it, and then it gets invented out from under you in a way and moved to the next place. So that's just one comment. But the other was that we keep trying to create a structure for creativity and participation, but maybe much of what's most interesting is sort of how do we identify the problem that needs to be solved, like the nurses did, in a particular context. So we're not going to run out of opportunities in that regard, even though the technology is constantly changing. But it's sort of how are we as designers nimble about entering into those conversations and offering ideas and facilitating engagement.
I thought there was going to be a response. Sorry. So, as a student who's been trying to outreach to the community or do projects that are more socially oriented, I've continuously seen that my work, right, the schoolwork, having to do all these class projects that I feel aren't necessarily what I want to be doing for the rest of my life, But how can students realize that there are opportunities for community engagement, and how can, there needs to be this dialogue with communities to solve problems. There needs to be a relationship, a continuing understanding of how we can, as students, help in a very small way, in a very engaging way, the community at large just here in Providence. And how can, students who want to be involved, right, get a greater opportunity to do the work that is social engagement?
I'm just wondering whether Camille and Lili could answer that as well, because you are grounded in these communities and have done a lot of work here.
I don't know how to answer. You want to answer?
Yeah, go on.
Sure. So, starting with rooting the process in a problem, the first question that comes to mind is who defines the problem and the process that you use to actually root yourself in that problem. But I strongly agree that having an abstract process that isn't based on relations. So looking around the terrain of Rhode Island and Providence, there are community-based organizations that already have a defined identity around a certain neighborhood or identity. And then there are obviously issues where around development, around potential use of space, for example, and how can you develop maybe a participatory action research or a community-based approach to that and be able to speak in different languages, right? Because what you need to do to pass a class versus what you need to do in a community to be respectful and participatory might be two different things. And this goes back to your question of literacy, right? So literacy, I would say popular education, like the example you gave, is about students and academics learning social skills often, right, that are based in the public, based in popular knowledge. And so it's a transformation both ways. You should see yourself as what is your potential role, and how do you not just come in to transform and give knowledge to other, right? You come in as a curious person with some skills to offer, but also an openness that you are willing to learn and also willing to follow, which is sometimes going to be it's going to be intention with what we're taught, right? Because you're going to go into a job market where you're competing, and you need to be able to be aggressive and prove your knowledge base. So there's a good amount of juggling, but I think students here can make a tremendous impact on some community issues. And I think that the processes that have been outlined are beautiful, wonderful examples that we can learn from, and figuring out how to apply them through conversation. And you have allies here in faculty.
What department are you in?
Industrial design.
Okay. So a number of years ago, a few faculty, students, and alumni formed an applied research lab here that was specifically for doing what you're asking. And we have worked, we work locally. That was what Damien referred to in Central Falls, and now beginning in Pawtucket. And we work internationally. And it was set up to address these issues and address them outside of the classroom, but also to bring component parts of them into the classroom, because those fit with the academic objectives, and the components that were more about research, about learning from those who actually were the primary stakeholders, those who were going to, who had the need, and those who had to live with whatever the outcomes were. And so that has existed. I also would say that, and it still exists, it's no longer part of RISD for various reasons. But there also are many student efforts that have come out of your department and have come out of architecture, and a little bit, or maybe more than I know of, from graphic design. But I would say those are kind of the three primary departments, or the architectures, maybe I should say, that have really driven more of the social impact and engagement work.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned I was like the STEAM in STEAM, right? I'm vice president of like STEAM stuff, so I've been working.
Okay, but one other thing I just want to mention is that in Design Lab, it's made up of both Brown and RISD people, and the Brown students at the moment are between international relations, economics, urban studies, environmental studies, and engineering. And the engineering department has very generously offered to pay for a website that actually will become a navigational tool for students like you who are looking for who else is out there, where existing partnerships exist. But it's basically how to navigate these two schools, how to find financial support. And then, I see sitting in front of you is Daniel Hewitt with our research office, which again is an incredible resource for whether it's about finding grant money or whether it's just about linking people together. And they have started a number of, with faculty, a number of discussion groups that are pulling together different faculty who have shared interests, and those are going up as websites. So again, there are a lot of portals, but nobody knows where they are yet from the student body. It's very hard for you to navigate, which is why we're trying to now build these online networks and mapping devices.
Should we just bring in a few more?
Could I just quickly to those two student questions? I think we have a very valid question, and if I should add something to what you two have been saying, I think that, it's natural when you start as a design student, you want to become a big signature designer. That's most people start like that, and then find out that maybe there's some other possibilities in life, and then becomes the question of what are the opportunities for doing something different than that, and you were describing a number of resources here, and if I look at my own school, what we try to do a lot is so the problem with doing a social design project as a student is often that the time is too short. You have to be, the things that you're engaging in takes more than a semester or a half semester. It takes maybe a couple of years, and so you have to go into something that is ongoing. And one of the things that we are offering our students is that we try to engage them in the research design projects that we do with the community and the city over time. And that may be quite similar. So they can go in and out there, and they would not be, some are frustrated because it's not, doesn't really give the possibility to come up with this product that I have designed, or this service that I have designed. You've been part of something that is much more collaborative and changed over time. But see, when schools start to acknowledge this and maybe lift up examples of how this was really considered a good design, even if it was ongoing for many years and didn't have very explicit outcomes, it was appreciated by the community, or in different ways appreciated. I think things can change, and I mean, someone like you, that's the beginning of something. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add, because in this kind of work, what we're often trying to do is build local capacity to be able to be in control of their own lives. And you know, that's a creative act, and the designer is in many ways more a facilitator than a designer with a big D. It doesn't mean that the people doing this work don't do the other two, but it's a commitment to applying your skills and expertise because you believe that it has a role to play in solving these bigger issues. And I would just add that, and this partly relates back to what you said, that your generation is redefining the disciplines. You know, academia is in a funny place right now because we're still training people for jobs that are in the past. And it's all changing. You know, even in our lifetime, just thinking of Anne, you know, we and Daniel, we've gone through a number of major recessions in the design world that have totally overthrown how design is practiced, how offices are constructed. The whole idea of security and longevity in a job has been also, Wolfgang, a whole bunch of people here have gone through it. And you know, now it's changing because you all believe that you have a far bigger role to play in society than we ever allowed ourselves at some level to believe, because we still were of the mindset that we had to fit into the world as it was. You guys don't believe that, and you shouldn't, because you're out to change the world, and you're out to change the disciplines which need to be overthrown and need to be rethought. So go for it.
Okay, I have a question. So, how does the role of digital technology or new technology do you take into account? Because in your presentation you mentioned about the emergence of iPhone, iWatch, all those digital devices that seemingly allows us to work beyond our working hours and beyond our traditional workplace. But on the other hand, I think there are a lot of downside of technology in terms of labor exploitation that are very elusive and camouflage. If you look at like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, and it's basically, it seems like it can allow you to make some extra money, but it's actually a very low paid, time consuming job that actually is taken by a lot of third country workers because their normal wage is very low. So it becomes an exploitation of the developed countries taking the human resource of the underdeveloped communities. And also on the other hand, not just the lower income community, but also the worker community in general, I think is somehow jeopardized or kind of changed because nowadays so many jobs are replaced by automation. So for example, the lady said in the past there used to be jobs specifically for transcribing text, and nowadays there are a lot of traditional type of jobs that are being replaced. So I think there are a lot of problems that are coming up. So I was wondering, how do you think we can kind of learn to anticipate problems instead of identifying problems that are readily obvious?
Thank you. So should we take these three and then we'll wrap up, or four? Yeah. So let's take four in a bunch, just to maximise participation.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned the women, the coalition of women, and they were working towards a social innovation, but it seemed that there was a disconnect with technology. Is there is there a problem, I'm wondering, in this day and age, where you have people who are working towards social change, but there's just not enough of a link between the digital and like the like there's so much work and entrepreneurship and money going into all these tech things, but there seems to be this disconnect between the social and, you know, these refugee crises. Like, how do you connect the two, and why is it being such a problem now?
Well, I'd also like to talk about the relationship between bottom-up and top-down. So let's say in like a working co-op environment where the workers are deciding what to do by just collectively signing up for something, rather than the CEO hiring a consultant to actually check all the stakeholders, do research, and figure out how to actually solve the problem. So finding that relationship between the two is very, very funny, and has always been very tricky for me as to like where to navigate, because as a designer, I would have to navigate through that process as well if I want to create social change. So maybe you can talk about that a bit.
Should we do one more, or is that too much?
So I would like to know how you as a designer judge whose voice is important in a participatory project. And I know that dissensus is very important in the process, but how much dissensus is productive and how much becomes too much?
Okay, so should we start with that?
Yeah, sure.
Move backwards?
Yeah. And that links, I think, to your question very much. And I think it's a good question, and I think it's very difficult to come up with a general good answer, because we'll always have to say that it depends. But in my view, the best, the most interesting way of collaboration is an agonistic collaboration, in the words of Chantal Mouffe, in the sense that you bring together actors with different agendas, and you acknowledge that they have different agendas, and you acknowledge that there are big power differences, but still you try to find a way of do something together, but not looking upon it as if you have agreed and there is consensus that's the best, but rather this is the best you can do given your the different agendas and competences and resources, etc. The problem with that model is that when you go to the concrete, for instance, we've been working with setting up a social incubator, a social innovation incubator, and we bring together people from a lot of NGOs that have worked in interesting ways in the suburbs with lots of socially extremely interesting projects, together with venture capital, with city officials, and in this specific case, this is 50, 60 people that do 4 workshops on this. And already on the second workshop, the main capital owner, industrialist in Malmö, he opts out because this does not fit with his interests anymore. So he said he sets up the incubator his own way, and he's got good connection with the politicians, so they do it. So how do you and this is new to me, how do you hinder that those in power opt out of these processes? I mean, before we've been very much occupied with how can those in the margin have a say in the process, and that's still fundamental. But it's also, if we want to have these agonistic processes, how do we make those in power stay and not just go away and do business as usual? I don't have an answer to this, and I don't think we're good enough at it. but it's kind of a challenge to live with. And I think that links to your question of participation, where I mean, participation is not a panacea. It's, for instance, we had during World War II in Scandinavia, we had a lot of participation, especially in Norway, which we called collaborators. I don't know if you have collaborators as well. Those who the Quisling government who were collaborating with the Nazis. So collaboration is not an easy thing. It always has to be situated again and try to and be aware of this is in the power game. And I mentioned before the murmuring of the idiot in the meaning of how do we set up these design encounters, and then there are those who just don't get it, we think, because it doesn't really matter to them, or we are not posing this in an interesting way. There's another challenge. How do we get better to listen at them? And maybe the point is that they don't want to be constructive. They are slowing the process down, but maybe that's exactly what is needed. Let's it then go slower. So I think there's a lot. I think the question is fair enough. Participation is not solving it, but and here I'm maybe an old-fashioned modernist. I still think that democratic participation is fundamental to our way of being social, and that also links to design. And as for the question of technology, I think that I mean, you're absolutely right, and I hope I did not argue for that we're always just running behind the latest technological innovation. I just wanted to point out what happened as what is often considered major design technology products and events, and what we're doing it at a similar time in a much smaller scale and with much less impact. And this is not without technology, I think. It's very open technology. But the important thing, and that's been a fight also at my school, is to say that we don't have to start with the technology. We can start with meeting, like with the nurses, and say, find out what are they troubled with, and from that start to do something that's rather than saying, well, we have now this new Newton or whatever the technology was, then how can we do something cool with that in the context of the nurses? It's a very different approach.
Okay, so shall we wrap it up there, and you can do your question afterwards, one-on-one, yeah? Is that okay? Just
well, I was just going to say something that pulls some of these things
okay, put it all together. Final words.
I think that listening to Zaza's and Nikolai's comments and some of the others, that the tension, you sort of outline moving from leaps forward in concepts of participation and leaps forward in design in these different decades. And I think that both Zaza's and Nikolai's question are in a sense about how things get turned into businesses, and how this constant struggle between a kind of democratic vision and an ability to turn it into a business proposition. So that what Zaza's saying about is kind of a tension between producing products versus social innovations and social structures. And the energy, the gravity is always going to go to the product, because you can produce business and sell it and things like that. And to Nikolai's comment, kind of how do you push back against the rise of the consultancy to come in? And we've figured out, process has now become a business. We can come in and tell you how to do your processes. So I think that your point about maintaining a kind of, or your solution about being local and sensitive to changing circumstances is one response to that, to that pressure. And maybe there are others, but I think just being alert to the forces of society at this point to try to monetize, to try to turn it into an app, to try to turn it into a business, that we just have a culture that's very oriented that way and not very oriented towards constructing real social enterprise.
Okay, so I would summarise as participatory design, it's hard. Yeah? It's hard, but be nimble, be thoughtful, be smart, be strategic, fight the battle. The battle is never ending, it is there to be fought, and onward and upward. So can I give a warm round of applause to everyone here, and just say we'll be continuing this discussion Friday and Saturday, so you would be more than welcome. Thanks very much.